Wasabi guys, coming back at y'all with another Commander Deck Tech video. This was yet again another one voted on by my patrons. If you are curious about that, I get some questions about it. My Patreon will be linked in the description, so go check it out if you feel like being a part of the channel, contributing, and you also get to vote on certain videos that I do, usually the deck techs and the Commander Secrets videos. I think those are pretty interesting to pull off. This time we have a pretty cool one, Zur the Enchanter, but this isn't your typical Zur the Enchanter deck where you just abuse the hell out of enchantments, making Zur next to impossible to touch. This one is instead going to fool around with cycling. This is a cycling deck, and there are a bunch of cards from Amonkhet block, Hour of Devastation, that are going to help out the cycling synergies, and there's a bunch of cards that we're going to use from those sets to help us win with this deck. It's very janky, it's not super competitive, so keep that in mind. It's also a deck that you can play with on an extreme budget. I mean, under $100, if you want to go even more budget, I could definitely see someone make a Zur deck like this under $50 and still have a lot of the key components. If you're unfamiliar with Zur, he is a 4-color Esper commander, a 1/4 flying human wizard legendary creature. Whenever he attacks, you may search your library for an enchantment card with converted mana cost 3 or less and put it onto the battlefield. If you do, you shuffle your library. Now, there's a lot of rulings interactions with Zur, but we don't really worry about them in this deck because for the most part we care about getting enchantments that are going to deal with cycling, and he happens to be the best possible commander, at least in my opinion, when it comes to a cycling deck, because a lot of the good cards for cycling are C3 or less enchantments. Now, as always with just about every single other deck tech, we're going to look at the lands first and any noteworthy ones. Of course, with our lands in this deck, we have a bunch of cycling ones, and one of the most noteworthy ones is Ash Barrens. Basic land cycling for just 1 mana is amazing, super efficient, technically counts as cycling, even though there's a difference between land cycling and just regular cycling. Both are going to trigger a lot of our enchantments and get the job done. Now, we also have a bunch of the other cycling lands from Onslaught, we have the ones from Urza Saga, and of course we have the ones from Hour of Devastation, all of which are going to contribute to this deck. More cycling cards means that we have an engine that we can keep going on with. And we also have the cycling lands from Amonkhet, I almost forgot to mention, that cycle away for just 2 generic, which is a big difference. You don't want to have to cycle away for colored mana. You would rather do it for generic because we can always reduce our cycling costs. But the rest is just going to be good value mana fixing in Esper colors. We don't want to have too many lands that come into play tapped because that's just going to make it harder for this deck to go off. You should be fine for the most part with basic lands. Moving on to our artifacts, we have 11 of them, and it's exactly what you would expect. For the most part, it's mana fixing. We have the obvious Soul Ring. We have all 3 of the signets in these colors. We also have both talismans in these colors, Talisman of Dominance and Talisman of Progress, all going to fix our mana for us, ramp us up a bit, make the deck a little bit quicker. And we of course have a Mind Stone. Can't really beat good value card draw, even if you do have to sacrifice your mana rock for it. And we of course have Commander Sphere and a Hedron Archive because these also give us the mana that we need and have the ability to sacrifice themselves to allow us to draw more cards. Now we go on to the key component of this deck, or at least one of them, Influctuator, just a 2 mana artifact that sits on the field. Cycling costs you up to 2 less to play. This is why I said before with the lands, you would rather have cycling costs that are just 2 generic because those are pretty much going to be free cycles, which in this deck is going to help us continue our turns and potentially win the game. Moving on to our creatures, we have 9 of them. For the most part, these are going to just be cycling creatures that we don't really care too much that they're on the field. We have Cloud of Fairies. This is a pretty interesting card. Just going to untap your lands, pretty much a free creature if you've ever played with it before, but we don't really care about that. It's a cycling for 2. With Fluctuator, it's going to be for free. So that's the main reason why Cloud of Fairies is in here. And at the very worst, we have a free blocker in the air. We have Auramancer, pretty cheap, a awesome budget way to get back any enchantments from our graveyard to our hand, and it is sometimes important if we want to keep our turn going to bring back one of the enchantments that can cycle itself away. That way we can yet again keep our turns going. We have Nimble Obstructionist, not necessarily one of my favorite creatures because it does have a weird cycle cost. It has that blue, so it's a little bit harder to cycle away, but yet again you want utility out of some of your cycling cards to make them useful in this deck. You don't just want a card in here because it cycles, but because at the worst case scenario it has some sort of usefulness. Vizier of Tumbling Sands. This one is actually pretty cool. When you cycle it away, you get to untap a target permanent. So we have some mana rocks that are going to tap for whatever mana that we need. We could also untap those, but pretty much going to be a more efficient cycling, because then we can just cycle it away for that blue, but then we can untap the land that we tapped for that blue. So it's a little tricky, but pretty cool. Curator of Mystery cycles away for 1 blue, but when it is on the battlefield, whenever you cycle or discard another card, you scry 1. So it's more efficiency. We get to help get to our other cycling cards quicker. We do have an Archfiend of Ifnir. This card is amazing in this deck. Kind of a cool way, a one-sided board wipe for your opponent's creatures. Whenever we cycle or discard a card, we put a -1/-1 counter on each creature our opponents control, and it does cycle away for 2. So yet again, another cool card that we can fool around with in this deck. We have Horror of the Broken Lands. Not necessarily something I was super excited to put in here. At first glance, it is rather weak, but when you're looking for a way to win outside of just with your cycling cards, something like this that can pump itself up, when you have the potential to cycle away a whole bunch of cards in a turn, this could be a win con. And then we have Eternal Dragon. Has plain cycling, but it is for just 2 generic. Don't really care too much about returning it back to our hand. Usually that's going to cost a lot of mana in our turn, but still pretty good that we can get some sort of planes to our hand. It doesn't have to be a basic plan, so it could be a shock land, anything like that. And then our last creature is a Scion of Darkness. A pretty sweet creature, but mainly in here because it also cycles, so kind of the same deal as with a lot of other cards in this deck. If we have it as a creature, it's going to have some sort of effectiveness, but the 3 generic to cycle it away is pretty nice. Moving on to our enchantments, we have 23 of them, a whole bunch for Zur to search up. Not always going to search them up, but they're here. Mystic Remora. This is one of the best cards in the whole deck because we have the potential to draw a whole bunch, and just discarding cards in this deck is usually good enough to trigger some effects, so having excess of maximum hand size is usually pretty good. We have Animate Dead, something we can search up with Zur and then bring a creature back. Pretty good utility. Argyle's Bloodfast is yet another cool enchantment. Paying 2 mana and 2 life to draw a card is going to help us get through our deck a lot quicker, and once we do get to flip it, we have a way to sacrifice creatures and then gain some life back. Then we have a Diplomatic Immunity, pretty much a staple in most Zur builds. Gonna make him very difficult to deal with, and that's not really the main reason why we want to play Zur. We don't really care too much about commander damage, but if Zur is going to help us win the game, we would rather him be on the board. We have an Island Sanctuary, kind of like a moat for this deck, but you do have to skip your draw step. But if you do, until your next turn, you can't be attacked except by creatures with flying and or island walk. It's a little bit slower because you have to wait till your draw step in order to get this to trigger, but still, the fact that you can tutor this up, kind of protect yourself from your opponent's creatures, even if it doesn't stop flying creatures, is still pretty sweet. And a cool thing about this deck is that we have access to these things called Runes of Protection. We have Rune of Protection for each individual color, and basically what they do is you just pay 1 white mana, and then they protect all damage to you from a black source or a white source or a green source. So they're kind of cool depending on what deck you're going up against, but again, these all cycle away for 2 generic mana, which is easy to reduce with Fluctuator. And also, like I mentioned before, with Auramancer, we can bring these back and then cycle them away. We have another key piece of this deck, which is Astral Slide. Whenever a player cycles a card, you get to remove target creature from the game. If you do, return that creature to play under its owner's control at the end of turn. So this is a cool way to protect Zur if your opponents want to board wipe, or if they want to target Zur. You can just cycle a card away, exile Zur until end of turn. Same thing with your opponent's creatures. If they're attacking you with a bunch of them, you can exile them away. Really cool to mess with tokens that way. We have Aura of Silence, Detention Sphere, more utility in enchantment form. Aura of Silence is just amazing. Being able to, at the worst case scenario, sacrifice it to get rid of a pesky artifact or enchantment is always nice, but it's usually going to be a good tax. And Detention Sphere is going to deal with just about everything else. We also have a Grasp of Fate, because this card is yet again more removal that we can search up with Zur. We have Drake Haven and Faith of the Devoted. These are 2 cards that are very powerful in this deck. If we have Fluctuator, it's basically just how much mana do you have that turn. You could potentially either wait till your opponent's end step to do this, which is usually what you want to do with Faith of the Devoted and Drake Haven, because then you can just save up all your cycles and then wait to get as much value as possible as you can and use a whole turn's worth of mana to get that value. Really sweet cards. We have Imprisoned in the Moon, kind of like the other cards, good utility that we can search up with Zur. Really messes with commanders pretty well. Nevermore, yet again, enters the battlefield, you name a non-land card, the named card can't be cast, so it's good hate yet again against commanders. And then we have a Pemin's Aura. This card is actually necessary in this deck because if our other cycling stuff doesn't work, we can use this to deal commander damage with Zur. All we have to do is just pump him up, and usually it's going to make it easier because we're swinging with Zur the whole game likely, so then we can start to actually deal commander damage. Also a good way to protect him. Then we have Heuristic Study, kind of the same reason as Mystic Remora. Having an excess of cards in our hands means that we're likely going to have to discard during our cleanup, so then we can just pay that mana for Faith of the Devoted or Drakehaven and get more stuff. We have Cast Out because it's a good way to deal with non-land permanents, and it also cycles itself away. New Perspectives is a way more expensive fluctuator. Kind of bad because we can't tutor it up with Zur, but also pretty good once we do get it out there. It doesn't really matter the cycling cost, it's going to be free, and we do get to draw 3 cards. And then we do have a Lake Claim, really expensive, which is sometimes worth that 7 mana, but more importantly, it's going to cycle itself away for 2 generic yet again. Then moving on to our sorceries, we have 6 of them. We have Unburden. Target player discards 2 cards, don't really care about that. Yet again, cycles away for 2. Wander in Death, rarely ever use it, but we could bring 2 creature cards back from our graveyard to our hand. Again, cycles away for 2. Then we have Decree of Justice, really epic spell if you're able to dump all that mana into it and get some angels, but more importantly, it does cycle itself away, and you could settle for soldiers if you want them. Then we have a Migratory Route, basic land cycling for 2, which is also pretty underrated, but this one is pretty funny. We could get some birds if we want them. Razaketh's Rights, this is like the only tutor that cycles, which is pretty sweet. It is 1 black, but we're likely just going to use this to get our Fluctuator, so that's pretty nice that we have that option. And then we have a Decree of Pain because this is a pretty sweet board wipe, and it does happen to cycle itself away. And then moving on to our instants, we have 13 of them. We have Angel Song. This is basically a fog. Prevents all combat damage that would be dealt to you. Cycles itself away for yet again 2 generic. Arcane Denial. Sometimes we need to counter a spell. This is not the bad one to play in this deck because we can draw some cards off of it. Even if we're given some card draw to our opponents, it's still worth it. We have a Censor. Cycles itself away for 1 blue, but it could also be a pretty decent counter spell if you want to be tricky enough to play it, force your opponents to have to pay that 1 mana. We have a Gilded Light. You can't be the target of spells or abilities this turn. Don't really care too much about that. Not too many situations where that's relevant, but yet again, cycles away for 2. Miscalculation, yet another counter spell. A little bit better than Censor because it forces them to pay 2, but most of the time we're just going to cycle it away for 2. Muddle the Mixture, pretty cool with the Transmute. Replaces itself with a Fluctuator, which is what we're, for the most part, going to transmute it for, but it could also counter an instant or sorcery. We have Without Weakness. If we really want to make it to where our Zur is indestructible, we want to protect him, we have that option, but yet again cycles away for 2. We have Complicate, another good counter spell that cycles itself away. If we do cycle it, we could counter a spell unless its controller pays 1, so it's kind of like Censor yet again, but a little bit worse. The cycling cost is a little bit harder to pay. We have Countervailing Winds, yet another cycling counter spell. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard. This one is actually pretty sweet because we're likely going to have a lot of cards in our graveyard, so this shouldn't be that difficult. A little bit better though because it cycles away for 2. Then we have Expunge, yet again finding more usefulness out of our cards that happen to cycle. This one could destroy a target non-artifact, non-black creature, but still pretty good, cycles away for 2. Forsake the Worldly, also cycles away for 2, but good artifact, enchantment, exiling, removal. We have a Rebuild, can bounce all artifacts to owner's hands, so kind of like a Hercule's Recall, but yet again cycles away for 2. And then our last card of the deck is Ancient Excavation, basic land cycling yet again for 2, but this one is actually pretty sweet because we could draw cards equal to the number of cards in our hand and then discard a card for each card drawn that way, so we could also trigger Faith of the Devoted or Drakehaven that way, which I think is pretty underrated. But anyway guys, that's going to do it for this deck tech. Let me know what you think about it. This was very weird, and I've had people talk to me about cycling decks with Zur before. Kind of overlooked it, didn't really care too much about it, but then I actually just decided to look up some of the deck lists, and I found some that really did interest me. I also put this deck together in real life. This is pretty close to what I actually built with the addition of some minor improvements, but for the most part this is what I'm also playing with in real life. I think it's a pretty sweet deck, really janky, not super competitive at all, very easy to get hated on when you're playing a commander like Zur, so be careful. This isn't going to be nothing but fun unless you're playing in a playgroup where your opponents know exactly what you're doing, which most of the time your opponents aren't going to hate on you if you're playing a super janky deck. They might if you're playing the more competitive Zur builds. But anyway guys, that's going to do it for this deck tech. Let me know what you think about it yet again. Void here signing off. Hope you all have a wonderful day. See you all next video.